So today was an intense class, so I'm trying to do something a bit lighter tonight, maybe also a bit flippant. Labor, immaterial labor, I have an epigraph for that from Hannah Arendt. Arts that do not produce any work share certain features with politics, end quote. And I'm going to talk about the period that we discussed already in some ways, but in different way, the period of the 60s in France that followed the Algerian War and that preceded May 68 with the eruption of consumerism in France. And I started to talk about Yves Klein. Yves Klein's discovery of Gaston Bachelard changed his life. He instantly connected to the childlike and transcendent element of Bachelard's poetics and appropriated for his own use this fabulous line, quote, "First there is nothing, next there is a deep nothing, then a blue depth," end quote. This was creation as Klein himself saw it, something coming ex nihilo before it materialized it into anything perceptible, depth in a pristine state, vibrating on its own until it turned into the blue void. In 1959, participating immaterially in a group show in Antwerp, Klein simply read out loud a passage from Bachelard while standing in front of an empty wall. It was enough. It filled the entire room. Bachelard was a philosopher of material imagination, but his own imagination was immaterial. It ransacked archetypes, mostly Jungian, that lay dormant in the collective unconscious in order to celebrate its own creation. His analysis of the four primary elements, fire, water, earth, and air, especially, fired Klein's imagination and inspired some of his most daring projects. France at the time was experiencing a major change. The consumer society was coming on its own, quickly grabbing and folding everyday life in plastic wrapping. In just a few years, it remodeled the entire social landscape, pumping in the main line new products and new desires. Bachelard's project, it turned out, had been a last-ditch effort to revive cosmogonies that were fast disappearing. Consumer society was homogenizing everything by showcasing signs that were timeless and immanent. The situationists denounced it as the society of the spectacle. Increasingly divorced from nature, consumerism was creating one of its own making, upholding form over content and system over substance. Bachelard had been doing just the reverse. The two projects were running parallel but at cross purposes, and only an artist like Klein could manage to have the two meet somewhere in infinite. At once shaman and showman, Klein simultaneously inhabited the two worlds, cosmic and cosmetic, and made them resonate incongruously but forcefully with each other. In the late 50s, as the French were busy quelling the violent rebellion in Algeria, Klein was waging a war of its own between line and color. In 1955, dismissing realism in painting, Klein devised a new kind of abstraction, relying exclusively on the singularity of color. He was, of course, aware of Malevich's precedent, but he merely considered him, as he said, a tourist of space, and insisted that it was in fact a Russian artist who had been copying his own monochromes. Klein's monochrome paintings were meant to liberate and lead pure color to triumph and final glory, end quote. Their radiance had something tangible, like an aura, a receptive condition Klein called sensibility, in which he felt cosmic energy flow freely. Monochromes were pictoriality in its primordial state, a climate rather than painting. The color didn't even have to be seen, just perceived as a glorious event. Between the summer of 1956 and April 1958, Klein displayed his cards in a succession. First, he settled his monochromic choice on a great color, the ultramarine blue, in effect starting what he called his blue period. Then 1 year later, in April 1957, he switched to the first immaterial at the Colette Alendi exhibition in Paris, cleverly bringing the two together in a fiery sublimation. By means of fire, Klein carried out the transcendence of blue to the void. This happened 1 year later in April 1958, effectively ending the monochromatic adventure. This exhibit, The Void, at the Iris Klein Gallery, was an epoch-making event, and yet it couldn't have been more inappropriate. Rebelled generals in Algiers had just staged a coup, and everyone expected paratroopers to be dropped over the capital. Paris was wrecked with violent blasts and massive popular protests. It was a hard time to celebrate sensibility and nothingness. The opening provided an unwitting commentary on the political climate outside. Leaving the gallery, Albert Camus simply wrote on the register, "After the void, full power," unquote. Just a few weeks later, General de Gaulle took over and proclaimed the Fifth Republic. Klein wanted to give his event the largest possible audience. First, he thought of parachuting a blue condom-like cover from a helicopter on top of the obelisk. Then he settled for a more realistic idea, flooding the Egyptian needle with blue light. Leaving the base in the dark, it would effectively send the prickly monument like a rocket off in its prime mystical splendor, as he said. Blue, in Klein's cosmic imagination, was becoming, quote, the coagulated blood issued forth from the raw sensibility of space, unquote. And he rushed to register it as AKB, International Klein Blue. Not surprisingly, given the circumstances and the jealousy of a few French artists, the authorization to flood the obelisk was cancelled at the last moment, and Klein ended up painting the walls inside the gallery white to signify the passage from his blue period to an invisible, intangible, immaterial color. Klein believed that if he concentrated his energy long enough in a certain space, people would feel the presence of his sensibility. Everything, including thought, occupied space. "I'm a painter of space," he declared later in 1962, removing what he had called his monochrome proposition from Colette Alendi's gallery. "You don't need them anymore," he added. "People can buy space." It was something else altogether, of course, experiencing this kind of charged presence of Klein's presence among the 2,000 people who mobbed the tiny space at the Iris Klein Gallery for a fee of 1,500 francs entry. 2 Republican guards in full regalia stood on either side of the draped entry. The draperies were blue, like the cocktails, giving an official cachet to the event. Klein loved pomp and ceremony. They reminded him of Catholic celebrations. He regularly paid his devotion to Nice's patron saint, Saint Rita, and joined in full regalia the Order of Saint Sebastian, a 15th century Rosicrucian sect he discovered in a book by Max Handel. Handel advocated levitation, a kind of immaterial sensibility, and in October 1960, Klein jumped from a mansard roof to the street, quote, into the void. Very well-known picture. A picture of his soaring performance, somewhat improved, was subsequently published in a made-up issue of Paris Soir on November 27, 1960, the day he officially stole from the history of the world. The void stole the show. The opening turned into a riot where people lined up outside and the police rushed to clear the street. Imperturbable, Klein regulated the flow with a loudspeaker. Pushing art beyond the limit of the gallery space, he managed to turn art into an art event into a street demonstration. The contrast between his mystical yearning, his flamboyant showmanship, and the political storm gathering outside was bewildering. The show culminated in a huge dinner at La Coupole, where Klein rashly delivered his revolutionary speech. It was the first leg of his Blue Revolution, a program he directly communicated to President Eisenhower 1 month later in an ultra-secret letter dated May 20, 1958, as France, he said, quote, was being torn apart by painful events, end quote. To avoid disorder or dictatorship, he respectfully suggested that the government be quickly formed in France with members of our movement, end quote, under the sponsorship of an international consulting body. The economy, in his letter, he said, would be stabilized through a barter system capable of providing real equality such that the rich man will necessarily be an authentic genius in his specialty. It was around that time that the curator and impresario Pierre Restany had the idea of bunching together Yves Klein with a mixed bag of artists hastily assembled for the occasion under the catch-all name of Les Nouveaux Réalistes. The group included his friend Armand, the collagist Romain Haynes, Tingley, and Christo, among others. At first, Klein balked at the idea, but Restany, counting on Klein's, quote, radiating influence on the group, he came up with a skewed definition. The new realism of pure sensibility, end quote. It was a clever oxymoron if there ever was one. Restany's group was an avant-garde movement, the way the surrealists were and the Situation International now aspired to become. In its most creative period, the situationist movement was bustling with experiments, ephemeral creations, des rives, détournements, etc., based on collective excitement, whose purpose was to loosen up the hold of the spectacle on everyday life. Increasingly, though, the situationists took a harder line. The games practically stopped, and critique of the spectacle came to occupy all the space. It turned into an obsession, a witch hunt in reverse, hitting adversaries close and far, especially those who were close. It started early on, actually from the very beginning, with the expulsion of a group of Italian experimental musicians in 1958. Debord denounced them for their idealist attitude and right-wing thought. Other expulsions followed the same year. Most of the dissent had to do with Michel Bernstein and Debord's hard political line towards art and their refusal to make any accommodation for the existing culture without, as he said, the free reconstruction of society as a whole. Their position, delaying making art anti-revolution come, was not exactly popular among the rest of the situationists who were mostly artists or architects. And their position clashed with artists and architects of the Dutch session led by Asger Jorn and Constant, who didn't expect revolution to come the next day. They advocated instead a collective, non-competitive attitude to art production. The rate of attrition became intense. Even Tchechglov, the man who invented the formula for a new urbanism, was expelled for madness in 1958. From a mental asylum, he vainly begged the board to stop the massacre. This exclusion, he wrote, should stop. I know it's not easy. One should foresee evolution, refrain from considering people in advance as suspects, the ideal of sort. Tchechglov was still caught in the mystique for which he had been sacrificed. Michel Bernstein call these kind of things recruiting by exclusion. It's an old game that situationists had not invented. They inherited it from the situationists. The surrealists and the surrealists took it from the Third International. Guy Debord was an artist in politics, and excommunication was his monochrome, the surest way he found to impregnate his audience's sensibility. The surrealist became the situationist became the suicidal avant-garde. Quote from Alexander Trotsky, one of the situationists that was eventually axed like the others. Guy thought the world was going to collapse and we were going to take over. But you can't take over the world by excluding people from it. He was like Lenin. He was an absolutist, constantly kicking people out, unquote. André Breton, again, I learned it from the political communist movement. Debord never tired of lashing on contemporary art. He called Klein's incantatory mysticism, as he called it, fascistic. Debord's acerbic critique of the neo-avant-garde at the time was not entirely unwarranted. The new realists were the vanguard of consumerism in art, and it was fitting that Restany would have marketed them and himself like a product. It was the first sustained and ultimately futile attempt by the French to reclaim their artistic preeminence, undermined by the French collaboration with the German occupants, followed by the landing of American appliances on their shores. Consumerism was a complete absorption of everyday life in a foolproof artificial landscape, a benevolent totalitarianism in which social relations among people were not dictated from higher up, but immanent to their lives, and mediated by images. As Debord wrote, not only is a relation to commodity visible, but it is all that one sees. The world one sees is its world. New realism belonged to this world. It was capitalism realism. This made it even more appropriate that Klein would cancel out images altogether from his painting and substitute immaterial space to the pollution of material science. Yes, simultaneously, Klein decided to sell his zones of immaterial pictorial sensibility as if they were materialized in an object. The invisible zone, moreover, were carefully numbered in series. For this unprecedented transfer, as he preferred to call it, Klein had to devise a special protocol. He would turn over his immaterial zone to buyers in exchange for 20 grams of fine gold. In return, the buyers would get something, not the non-existing art world, obviously, but a signed receipt. The alleged artwork, the non-existing artwork, the material artwork, would be sold for the price of gold. Receipt and gold, paper sign, and fetishized metal stood for the immaterial zone and actually replaced it with their own materiality. Klein immediately tackled another challenge, making these signs themselves immaterial. In essence, not only would buyers get nothing to show for on their walls or in their vault, but they would be asked to forego the only proof they had of ownership. There was an element of cruelty in that, and it was pretty radical too. It went at the root of the speculative nature of art. How much of nothing can be worth something? It was conceptual art in an extreme form. Conceptual artists were trying to avoid commercialism, and Klein was confronting it headlong in his own terms. Klein's speculation on the immaterial proved by the absurd that art wasn't what it was supposed to be. Opposing capitalist art, Klein was challenging capital itself to become an art object. All that was left to do was erase the last traces of the deal. The event was carefully staged like a religious ritual. It happened by the River Seine in front of witnesses, with Notre Dame prominent in the background. The receipt, written on a special checkbook printed by the Iris-Clare Gallery, was specially burnt, and the gold in thin sheets were thrown in the wind and landed in the Seine. Both were returned to nature, to the prime element, fire, air, water, thus restoring the dematerialized signs of capital to its cosmic flows. There was something more to come. Klein entitled the buyer himself to transfer his immaterial zone to someone of his choice, and he insisted that it would double in value. The rule was hardly new. The value of artworks, as we know, increases with each time it changed hands. This speculative aspect, relative to the market, is generally presented as eccentric to the art, but here it became purely speculative precisely because there is nothing to speculate on. Actually, the added value was simultaneously, as he said, subtracted because more gold would be thrown in the wind. Besides, the remainder of the gold, one half was set aside, didn't go to the artist, but was entrusted to one of the witnesses. No one, in other words, got anything tangible in the operation. Yet, what was derived from it was totally exorbitant. It established that a non-existent artwork could be the object of a real transaction, and destroying the record of the sale, a further proof of ownership. The transaction had become a gift in a Marcel Mauss sense, an open challenge to the idea that anything could be simply exchanged. There was more to it than meets the eye, especially since there was nothing to see. Klein made it an obligation to escalate the exchange even further, destroying the process whatever possession anyone might have. The transfer was constantly changing forms, and so was the art itself. First, an artistic speculation, then a financial transaction. It then turned into an anthropological fiction, a potlatch generating prestige, linking prestige to loss and sacrifice. What Klein, in fact, had been doing was recapitulating step by step the genealogy of value, returning it to its mystical essence. The value existed independently of its materiality. Signs were the stigmata of capital. Klein has often been accused of being a provocateur. He's not the only one. Granted, by provocation of what? First, of art. Like a conjurer, Klein managed to mobilize all the speculative codes of art without ever materializing its object, questioning the acquisitive impulse that lies behind any materialization of art. The Italian writer Dino Buzzati, buying his share of the immaterial zone directly from Klein, couldn't resist hiding a piece of the burnt receipt in his pocket. It was better than nothing. But there was still something else. These gifts were also a provocation to thinking. Everything, including thought, occupies a certain space, endowed with an energy that can be communicated. In that respect, art isn't that different from philosophy, whose purpose is to capture non-visible forces with its concepts. Klein, the untutored mind, was a philosopher brute, just like Champagne. Pino Galazzio, the only situationist painter who was allowed to practice his art with a vengeance, provided another proof ad absurdum to the problem of the immateriality of art. But he did it in reverse, bringing out instead the total materiality and materialism of art. It was probably Galazzio and the situationists who had Klein in mind in his famous, Klein's famous Sorbonne lecture of June 3, 1959, when Klein mentioned the artists who have often attacked my way of painting, end quote, and he insisted that when he navigated in the sea of sensibility, end quote, he wasn't any more interested in any sign or gesture than they, the situationists, implied, were. Klein was reaching out to the situationists. You have to realize that the Paris art world at the time was extremely small, and Klein and Debord, who's supposed to be the fiercest enemy, of course, knew each other. Actually, Debord owned a painting by Klein, an early painting by Klein. So it was a game, it was a political game, and it was a count game, it was art. Klein was reaching out to the situationists. To a jeering audience, Klein, referring to Descartes' automaton, prophesied that painting machine would soon do the job and churn out abstract art, spectacular, quote-unquote, to the highest degree. Pino Galazzio already had unabashedly done that. He fabricated his industrial painting by the mile, actually handmade huge rolls with rudimentary painting machines. They were meant to cover cities and highways and eradicate art altogether through the inflation of the product. The rolls were sold by the meter, and to Galazzio's huge embarrassment, they sold very well. There is no way out of the spectacle. It didn't take much to be eased out, Pino Galazzio, no, it didn't take much to be eased out of the situationist movement, and Galazzio was finally expelled by Debord in 1961 for collaborating with ideologically unacceptable forces, just like two other situationist architects accused of having built a church. It may not be totally coincidental either that Galazzio's major exhibit in Paris, called Anti-Material Cave in 1959, to which Debord himself collaborated, strongly echoed Klein's own work. Like Klein, Galazzio had a mystical sensibility allied with a faith in modern science, and his cave, 140 meters of industrial painting wrapping up the entire interior of Galerie René Drouin, was uncannily reminiscent of the void unwrapped the year before. Galazzio called his show the uterus of the world, a wink at Courbet, and had fashion models parading throughout the space, dressed in the same painted material, pretty much as Klein, 1 year later, walked his street models covered with blue paint as part of his great Action spectacle. It would be difficult to disentangle here what belongs to whom and who is parodying the other. Actually, it shouldn't have mattered much, as the situationists encouraged lifting ideas freely from their magazine, which didn't prevent from accusing Henri Lefebvre from having stolen the idea that they debated about the 1871 Commune and expelling Henri Lefebvre himself from the group, which of course he never belonged to. One thing for sure, they were all tackling the same issues, Klein, Debord, at the same time, and often came up with similar solutions to non-existing problems, as Alfred Jarry would have said. That this problem didn't really exist made them no less important. Klein's anthropometries, blue body imprints made with living brushes, the painter didn't touch a canvas for the woman's body, also came back full circle to the anonymous handprints on a cave's walls, a vision of Eden regained similarly cast in a technological world. Technology could also be hell, and Klein vividly remembered the human shadows immaterialized on the stone in Fumio Kamai film on Hiroshima. At bottom, Klein's attempt to create a pictorial ambiance, a mental environment transmitting sensibility independently of any object, was hardly different from the situationist effort to construct what they called unities of ambiance by roaming aimlessly through the city, what we call a drift. Actually, their projects were related. Only by doing away with any mediation could one directly perceive assimilated, the Klein's word, the prime state material of sensibility. Both interventions were meant to create ephemeral force-filled, transitory passageways in a spectacular world by applying a certain kind of art to life. The absolute art Klein evoked in his Sorbonne lecture had nothing to do with a kind of ego-driven art that the situationists refused as part of contemporary alienation. It was a common effort to develop creative imagination, according to Bachelard, that is supposed to exist within each person in the face of the universe. The situationist expects this change to happen through disorientation in the streets. But Klein wasn't so far afield. He was planning to entrust the change that he had in mind to an international sensibility center, a kind of rehabilitation clinic for sensitive training, meant to free individuals from their crippling individualism. If Klein's center wasn't a preparation for the revolution to come, as the situations would have it, rather inspired by the spirit of chivalry and medieval guilds revisited by the Bauhaus. The center would enlist Klein's friend and advisor, including Moshe Dayan for martial arts, to teach men of heart and head, quote unquote, a curriculum enhances sensibility and give full power to their creative imagination. The duty to quality, cultivated in defiance of well-spread materialism, the cult of quantity, was at the heart of Klein's Blue Revolution. It was also, in a less elitist way, but this is debatable, the main concern of the situationists. Debord invoked not absolute art, but integral art. But the difference wasn't that significant. Absolute art, as Debord conceived it, wouldn't have the kind of permanence attributed to art in general. Nothing to do either with a lyrical abstract of contemporary painting, which claimed to produce emotional effect through free poetic lines and forms. It would be based on the atmospheric effect of room, hallways, and street involved in the concrete construction of momentary ambiances of life and their transformation into a superior passional quality, and quote from Debord. This art would no longer correspond to any of the traditional aesthetic categories, including architecture, because it would be an integral composition of the milieu. And Debord added, changing the way we look at streets is far more important than changing our way of looking at a painting, end quote. This transformation could only be realized by urbanism as distinct from architecture. Klein had come independently to the same conclusion during his German period. In 1959, he was invited by the architect Werner Runho to decorate the Gelsenkirchen Opera in the Ruhr with a team of artists and architects. Norbert Kricke installed a water sculpture in the entrance, Tingley covered interior wall with kinetic paintings, while Klein himself contributed huge IKB blue monochrome panels and monstrous relief sponges soaked in blue paint. Together with the master architect Runho, he designed the air roof on top of the building's cafeteria and fire jets and walls of blue fire. All these elements, air, fire, light, and water, fired his imagination, and it wasn't long before he decided to involve Runho and Kricke in a rather insane urban project meant to take art and society further towards the immaterial. They simply called it the air architecture in relation to the conditioning, the climatization of the earth. It wasn't the first time Klein had the idea of altering the urban landscape through punctual intervention. After his failed attempt to illuminate the Place de la Concorde, Klein seriously envisaged, with the help of architect Claude Parent, who collaborated with Virgil, another architectural project, blowing fires of various Parisian fountains, materializing the meeting of fire and water. He also graciously offered to paint in blue all future nuclear explosions. Klein was fascinated by levitation, and he became very enthusiastic at the thought of using air heavier than air for his new projects. Like Constant's New Babylon, air architecture was utopian and mythological. What Klein intended to bring back was nothing else than Eden itself. So did Constant, except that his own project was more heretical, New Babylon. Actually, it was Debord who had prompted the name, a blatant vindication of decadence and revolution. This didn't prevent Debord, as early as in 1951, from violently clashing with Constant on the question of utopia, which Debord envisaged in terms of immediate political action. You have to choose, he dropped, between a description of the Golden Age and the austere periods of its preparation, end quote. Being an architect and not a messiah, Constant saw no reason to shelve his projects. Instead, he decided to devote himself instantly and without delay to the detailed description of New Babylon using architectural drawings, collages, and photomontage. Not being an architect himself, Klein simply asked Runho and Parent to work out the detail of his own construction. Both Klein and Constant intended to free people from the heavy envelopes of stone and cement that kept them separated. But while Klein directly aimed at immateriality, sweeping in one bold stroke everything that would stand in the way of the limitless horizon, invariably AK blue, Constant was more level-handed. He conceived New Babylon. New Babylon was inspired by a camp of gypsies that he saw at Pinot Galazzio, and he tried to build something that would be as fluid and nomadic a construction as the one nomads themselves had. So he had an exact model in mind, and he decided to build for the gypsies themselves a permanent site. New Babylon was conceived for a society arrived at the stage of utopia, rid of all material needs, fully automatized leisure, and returned to the pure exercise of the imagination. In this utopian society, in New Babylon, everyone would be free to create their own life and give them the shape of their desires. I don't know if you know, but the Pompidou, the museum in Paris, was built slightly after that, according to the same, with the same aspiration as Constant's own building. And what is not known is that the architectural project was presented internationally for the project that would be best, that would be chosen by the international jury of architects. And what was chosen that became Pompidou, Pompidou himself hated it so much that he tried everything to break the offering or the competition that's been made, but he wasn't capable of doing it. And then the Pompidou Center is in fact exactly what Pompidou tried to refuse. And it was exactly the kind of building that Constant had in mind, since he had for the inside out, and it was made of very mobile walls that could be pushed around according to the whim or the needs of the people that lived inside. Okay. And just to add something, the same way the Sacré-Cœur was built on top of the Butte Montmartre after the victory of the French bourgeois army against the Communards in 1871, the Pompidou project was built on the very place that its situationists had conceived as the best place to drift through Paris. And it was the most popular district in Paris, and it was replaced by this awful garden that now exists. Homo sapiens turned Homo faber and turned Homo ludens, everyone would be delivered in this building, New Babylon, to playful time, adventure, mobility on the wildest scale. This nomadic life, nurtured by an artificial, entirely constructed environment, was the urban expansion of the situationist drift through the bourgeoisie that Galacio vainly attempted to represent in his own grotesque grotto. Like a labyrinth, this environment would translate into a kind of fluid urban space extending to the entire world, quote, a structure no longer made of clusters as in traditional habitat, but espousing the tracing, both individual and collective, of wandering networks of interrelated units, forming chains that could develop and extend in all directions, end quote. It was a far cry from the neutral containers of social relation implemented after the war widely by functionalist architects. The concept of unitary urbanism developed by Constant and Debord in 1958 meant to define the construction of situation. The situations derived their name from the creating of events, fleeting events, where groups would roam through cities and talk to each other through talkie-walkies so that they would be totally disoriented in cities, and being disoriented, they would lose their consciousness, or their consumer consciousness, and be returned to some sort of innate purity of mind, right? Saved from consumerism, that was the idea. It involved a complex or continuous activity meant to recreate the human environment through the exercise of collective creativity. Passivity was a major element produced by the spectacle. The spectacle, as a surrealist defined it, deliberately created separation and passivity. People were supposed to stay at home watching television, basically, and being isolated, alienated from the rest of the city. In Klein's own radiant world, spatial disorientation were replaced by a concentration of energy. His project was even more radical because all the obstacles, walls, partition, and roofing, everything that privatized space and excluded other kind of human relationship simply were removed. Made of thick, pulsed air, they became transparent, invisible, and intangible. In short, immaterial. Klein had young women lying on odalisques made of air lifted from the ground by gazers, levitation on beds massaged the body. Flows of pressurized air capable of covering huge amounts of land like an immense air roof protected humans from rain or storm and adjusted atmospheric conditions to their desire. This enchanted garden was reminiscent of what Bachelard called houses of wind that a simple blow would dissipate. Thank you. Sure. But,
notwithstanding your, disdain for Pompidou, the vast majority of artists.
I don't know. It's not my design. Pompidou's design for Pompidou.
Oh, it just seemed like you didn't like it either.
I like it a lot.
Okay, cool. Then, well, the vast majority of artists want their work in museums, and they wanted to go to a museum eventually. And Yves Klein came up with this piece where it's transferred. It's nothing. It's transferred for gold. It gets destroyed. So obviously the piece only exists if it keeps getting transferred. So this begs the question: was this piece acquired by any institutions? And if so, how do you feel about that?
If the piece had been acquired by an institution?
Has it?
Could have been. There is nothing there. See what I mean? I mean, don't we have now performances that become art?
Well, yeah.
That was a performance.
Of an institution that might have acquired it, and if so, how did they deal with it?
Yeah. There's a story, another story attached to it. When Pompidou was opened, they asked Bourdieu to make an investigation and see if the purpose of the Pompidou had been fulfilled. The purpose of Pompidou and the transparency of the walls, etc., was meant to attract the population. See, it was like the French always trying to create museum, but at the same time wanting it to be, made for the people, right? So Bourdieu made this inquiry and realized at the end of the year that the distribution of the population was exactly the same as any other institution behind. So the whole purpose was kind of self-defeated. But Baudrillard wrote a pamphlet at the time, right, which he could have called Forget Beaubourg, right? What did he say? He said, no, on the contrary, very demagogically, the institution wanted to justify their existence by making them art available to the people. But Baudrillard, I heard that the Pompidou could only contain a certain number of people. Right? Beyond a certain quantity of people, the building would collapse. And then he imagined that the population embraced the Pompidou exactly as the director of the Pompidou envisaged and desired, and that en masse the population would embrace the Pompidou and that the building was entirely collapsed under mass. Right? That was upping the ante, challenging the institution. Right? Yeah.
I had an art handling job in LA in 2006, and one of my tasks or jobs was to move an inclined table, which involved emptying all the glue from the table into little baggies, and then moving the table. And we moved it from one home in Beverly Hills to the second one, and the wife didn't like it, so we had to move it to the owner's office after that. And I ended up with a bag of lime glue somehow in my box. And I painted a series of 12 paintings with it, numbered 1 through 12. I was wondering if you could comment on that in relation to your story.
So you extended Klein beyond his death, is that what you did?
I don't know, I'm asking you.
That's good an answer I can. So what I was trying to do is, in a sense, say that all this kind of political opposition that were going on at the time were extreme. The situations were extremely violent towards everyone who was not only making art, but also making it in the name, of the medieval guilds, etc., etc. So the animosity was very patent. And from a distance, I was struck by the fact that structurally, they all belong to what we define today as the episteme. They belong to the same 60s episteme. Even the way they built the building was exactly the same in the case of Constant or Yona Friedman. They hid the technology underground because the technology was obtrusive and ugly, right? And then the first floor was left for the cars to circulate. So the building were all in pilotis, in piles, right? Because the car had become unavoidable, but they wanted to get rid of it as fast as possible so they would circulate and be gone. And then the actual habitat was the second floor, and the roof was a garden where helicopters also would land. So it's very striking when you look at the conception, both artistic and architectural, to see that whatever political dissension were involved at the time are still involved now. And I know many people who could be very upset by my putting together Yves Klein and Debord, who are totally incompatible. But I think that if you push each of them in their own delirium, paranoid on one side and maybe schizophrenic on the other, they would actually meet someplace, and that's what I was trying to do tonight. Yeah?
I heard stories about Yves Klein and this Situationist International that they would come up with useless jobs to try and get themselves money to survive, such as coming up with horoscopes for horses.
Yeah.
for the horse races. Do you have any stories like that?
No, in fact, they refused to work. Remember that the name of the magazine they created before they actually became Situationist International, they were part of the Letrist group. And when they broke up with the Letrist group, because a series of breakups, they called themselves the Letrist International. At that time, they were living like hippies. They published a magazine called Potlatch, who was distributed for free, right? And for the rest of the time, they considered that any contact with capitalist society was to be avoided, and they deliberately didn't work. So they left. They survived out of their wits, which means, they were hanging out with what's it, Malfrat, or something, and they romanticized the fact that they were hanging out with people who were like not doing very legal thing and involved themselves in a number of manipulations that were not exactly legal. Also, they received painting from the people they expelled. Like they expelled Yorn, but Yorn contributed painting afterwards until the end and the dissolution of the group. So basically, it's a tradition of the 19th century. An artist doesn't work, right? And leisure, in other words, they lived a life of leisure out of their own wits, but they never were involved in the kind of labor that they tried to free from the factories, right?
For your presentation. I was wondering if there is something that you could say as well of the way in which they use devices to navigate, and so maps as devices.
You mean the situationist?
Yes.
Yes.
And walkie-talkies, and how, for me, Constant also had the same way where the plans and both the plans and the division in zones.
Yes.
Were again navigational maps that would create what we would say the freedom of the grid, meaning the kind of an established order against which you can actually go. And it seems to me that the version of the map to navigate, so the instruction of it, is as well a technology. And there is always this vague concept of what technology is.
Yes.
These things.
Right.
And I was wondering if in your work, in your study of the subjects, were you ever confronted with the way in which they define technology in relationship to the way in which they needed to navigate in a different way?
But
perceived in a different way.
yeah, they were trying to define emotional zones, just like Yves Klein. Because in Paris, like in all cities, some zones are full and carry energy, and emotional energy, and others were dead. Right? Even from one street to the next, one side, as you see, for instance, in Boulevard Saint-Michel, one side, the left side, when you go down towards the river, the left side is always nearly deserted, but the right side is always full. So what they say that they abandoned themselves to emotional, energy-driven zones, and part of their itineraries was to identify this zone. And of course, the zone that was the most pregnant with energy and emotionality were the popular one. And that's why the Halles was the most powerful zone, and the only one that was actually cartographed, right? Of course, what they were doing was not only identifying this kind of difference of level of intensity of different districts or different zones in Paris, but also it was a way of changing Paris into a labyrinth. See, I think you talked about that today, about Lyotard. The labyrinth is not something that exists, but something that you create out of whatever architecture exists. And that was the purpose of the walkie-talkie. The situations were dividing themselves in two groups. And each group has a walkie-talkie and were talking to the other group and describing for them the streets that they were crossing or they were following. So that what each group, the description that each group received from the other was totally deterritorialized, right? and mixed with the one that was under their eyes. So what they received through their ears was different from what they were seeing. It was a juxtaposition of the seeing and the hearing that created this sense of disorientation through the city. And the disorientation was exactly what they wanted to do. They wanted to create a map of the city, but also use their map in order to reclaim their consciousness that they were afraid of losing because of the pressure of the consumer society. So it was a multiple level. It was level of deterritorialization, but also reterritorialization on territories that were not their own. So it was more complex than it looks like. And it was also what they call the psychogeography. In other words, the study of the various zones that could provoke certain reaction in them. And even in this respect, we were very close to Klein, and is a zone of sensibility, with material sensibility. So close that I was very surprised that no one puts them together, because everyone is used to oppose them so much that there was no contact between them. But as I mentioned, they knew each other to the same group. They had similar idea. They worked with a material that was very similar, except that the way they used it was exactly contradictory, but similar. You know? The situationist group was trying to save themselves from a consumer society, and Klein wanted to create a corps of artists who would be immune for the corruption of modernity. Same idea, right? Just different ways of going to God.
That's why I was asking about technology, because we tend to call technology to a very specific type of apparatus.
Yes.
And for me, they both seem to have evolved a particular technology.
Yes, definitely.
So both constants or
In fact,
situations.
yeah.
Why actually emphasizing and almost institutionalizing that practice of people that had very specific rules causing that to move to also the fact that it was a new mode of creating maps that had also very particular rules on how it should influence perception.
Yes.
I think we can call both that and then the erasure with blue technology itself. And I was wondering if that, I mean, that's an opinion. I'm kind of asking you if that is if you ever came across that their statement or
what Pino Canaccio was doing was using the technology to print. And but the technology used was the technology that was very primitive, doing by hand, walls of painting, etc. But it was still a technology that produced miles of printing. What Klein was doing was using also a machine which was the body of these models. Right? So the idea in both cases was not to do a paint that would be humanly created. Right? It was created by, not through mediation, but it was created by certain apparatus which involved various reconfiguration of the given body. Right? So maybe that could be an answer. I find it's very interesting attempt, if you want, to make art that's an art that would either inflate value or that would deflate the possibility of any sort of acquisition. I think that at the stage of the art, in the art world that we are, where we don't exactly know what is art and what is not art, there was a lot of anticipation of that, and also of an attempt to preempt what has been happening over the last 10 or 20 years to the art world, that we don't know the difference between art and commerce. And retrospectively, it became interesting that the situations were so adamantly opposed to art, especially to painting. Right? And it was interesting also that the situations were reintroduced in the art world in the 80s, which meant at the very time when the art world was being bought by the market. And what was reintroduced of the situationists was not what they said about painting, but what they said about architecture. Because they were very positive towards architecture, but they were negative towards painting. And what was not brought out immediately was, of course, the fact that their critique of art was much more all-encompassing than the artwork would take at the time, or needed at the time. Right? So all this is kind of interesting, what happens from America to France and to Europe and from Europe to America. There was something happening there that would, in a sense, anticipate everything that happened before. Of course, I don't especially like the situationists or the exclusions. Right? It became like a total dictatorial machine. It was like Breton and the labor group that people kept expelling people. Expulsion, some people were. Lefebvre took him, it took him about 20 years to recover from the fact that he was totally chased away by the situationists. It's exactly the same kind of political operation that were current in the Soviet Union. You make people feel terrible or feel guilty because you put them in jail or because you accuse them of something. So all this is not exactly of my liking. But when I look back and I read back the situationists, I realize that they were right. Basically, art had to be bound to the market, and now what's happening is maybe an extrapolation of art now is so much of everything that art is in a sense disappearing. It's like pushing a good thing so far that we don't even know what a good thing is. And fortunately, the only thing that's happening now is that the only thing that allows art to be recognized as art is the institution, museums and the market. So unfortunately, the more deterritorialized the art is, the more territorialization there will be on the institution. So we're not done with art yet. But we may be done with a certain kind of art.
So it's been a real pleasure to hear the kind of debate of the situationists. And one of the things that I think, this is kind of both a question and a comment. In 1967, when Dada did La Chinoise, and the way that they were trying to figure out these ideologies of kind of Maoism versus the kind of Stalinism, all this. I mean, De Boer was a Stalinist, which is always.
De Boer was?
He was a Stalinist. And it's very
no. No. He participated in socialism in Bulgaria. He was totally cool as to what was actually happening in Russia for that reason.
Okay. Well, many of the issues that I think are intriguing about psychogeography have been inherited by the cellular phone culture that we live in now, and the way people are playing with geography and deterritorialization and globalization. So one of the issues that she mentioned earlier about looking at transference of properties and characteristics, I would love to hear your take on some of the more current situations, like say, for example, what Doug Aiken's been doing with Doug Aiken, for example, he's been sort of doing sound works, dropping microphones in Brazil and then having the sound go to New York, or people are playing, like even Namjoon Pike's Global Groove, where it was the first music video to sort of deterritorialize the whole idea of dance and movement. But what was good to me, the funny thing about the French kind of, how should I say, mauvais foi, the Sautine kind of idea here, is this like, they still were trying to grapple with the relationship of post-imperialism. They couldn't kind of quite reposition themselves with the Algerian War.
After the Algerian War?
Yeah, the Algerian War's going on, Vietnam, the loss of the sense of imperial kind of presence. And I would love to hear your take on where French art is now. Like what psychogeography and deterritorialization have really presented was a critique of specific geographies. Paris was a labyrinth, like you're saying, but the cell phone has now inherited the same kind of situation. What's your take on that?
I was about to say that he anticipated cell phone not just because they were talkie-walkies, but because the purpose of the talkie-walkie was to deterritorialize them. And as we know now, there's lots of studies going on where people that they use their cell phone, they have no idea what they are. They have no idea they're crossing the street. They have no idea who is beside them. They have no idea, in buses or that. People are not where they are. They're totally deterritorializing on the spot, right? So but the difference is that now everyone is isolated, not in their house, but outside. In that way, everyone moves with a little bubble, and the consumer society managed through technology to isolate everyone in a context of instant communication, so that you're connected with the entire world as you want, but you're totally disconnected from what surrounds you, right? And you totally disconnect with some sort of continuity that would make up a life. And what the situationists were trying to do was reclaim their life. In that respect, they were not just critical of the consumer society. They were trying to implement today, at the moment where they existed, another form of living, right? And in that respect, there's still something to be learned for situationists, although, it failed, obviously, it was bound to fail.
But in the same context, it became a social network, like the way people would specifically choose the people they were talking with, they were kind of going between the frequencies of the walkie-talkies.
Yes.
And even if you were in a different frequency, you might pick up random fragments of other people's conversations, in much in the same way that the social networks
Right.
kind of respond to now, because you're never quite sure who you're corresponding with, where they are. You could be getting a message from someone in the North Pole, but you're sitting here in Switzerland or something.
So they were, in fact, DJs without knowing it.
Right now, the movement is called enhanced reality or enhanced realism, and there's a lot of people working on the idea of the cell phone as a kind of mapping device. So you hold your phone up, and there's a software that recognizes
Right.
everything,
Right.
and you can attach icons like GPS maps in Google.
Yeah.
But there are people who play games with that, like they'll erase whole streets.
Mhm.
Like if the sensors of the GPS signal detect, but say you're walking down Broadway, but someone has erased the data for Broadway, it would say something else. Or there's streets now that have vanished because they haven't been documented or archived in Google Maps.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of kind of kids
There's
out
lots of games that
Yeah.
invented. Yes, I agree. But that comes with technology. See, technology is what allows you the worst and allows you the best. In other words, it can increase the isolation that the situationists will try to upset through their games, etc. But they can also open up, a whole network of possibilities. My only, the realization, was I remember Guattari, Perillo at the beginning of the pirate radio and at the beginning of the internet, reclaiming the idea of the global village, of the idea that a network could be done, and through network something that could happen, so that a multiplicity of small, contagious society could be created and all that. Unfortunately, it didn't happen like that on a massive scale. It's a possibility of it existing, but at the same time, it eradicates the possibility maybe of using technology in a different way. Not entirely, and you're right, there's interferences. The world is not made of what you hear only in talking walkies. But I'm a bit cautious about the embracing technology without any qualification.
Other questions? Thank you.
I'm not sure what the question is, so I said to ask, but I think, especially the gold leaf transaction, it seems an interesting way of having a patron become more of a collaborator than somebody, since having money become, a tool for participation than anything else, but, especially contemporary now, it seems like people talk most about what's collected, it's all about getting the collections, and so you have not just the museums, but these private collectors who are developing these private collections with a very specific vision that makes them not only the patron, but like a curator of a space. And there are spaces that have been, specifically designed in collaboration with a whole number of artists that are in some way enhancing the creative, both the creative process and the experience as a, somebody coming, secondhand at it to see it with a vision. So rather than some sort of historical, like here is everybody from this period, or here is this message, but someone who's like, this is, in my mind, this is my creative, or my, like a very personalized view of something that's beautiful, or something that has meaning, and so it's almost empowering the patron to take this other role. So it's almost like
Do you think they have enough power to service?
well, but it's like taking the money, it's sort of like, well, it's just there, so it's not necessarily of value, any more than say like the ability to draw, it's like it's the ability to facilitate something, because where else is it going to go, right? I mean, there's that art, like, the tables that end up in these random offices, where there are actually people who are creating spaces to bring other people into that are not involved, I guess what I'm saying, it's not involved with a governmental organization, it's not involved with a state-funded, creative, some concept of culture that is, what you're perpetuating, but it's more of a, anyway, I'm not sure where this is going, but it's that's why I sort of was half up, half down, but, okay, maybe we just start.
But the idea of participation, yes, in other words, the work involved all the participants, right? And it kind of made it, the fact that the traces disappeared made it even more like a sacrificial experience, right?
Yeah.
And of course, what we were talking in class about the symbolic exchange, that's exactly what it was about. Because something happened that the art was created with everyone's participation, and the art was destroyed also collectively, so that everyone was supposed to be changed as the operation. We could put that, pretty much on level with what Artaud tried to do with his theater, because as I said, it was very cruel to have people leave without having anything in their hands. One of them had to steal and put a real piece of burnt paper in his pocket, right? So it was a sacrificial, it was giving art a sacrificial value in a context of consumerism where exchangeability has become the rule. That's why I find so interesting is that the most revolutionary of the two groups, the Klein group, if you want, and the situationist, may not have been the situationists. Because using a symbolic approach to art, they managed in a way to make art unavailable to commerce. See? So we could switch the role, the most obviously political, the correct way. We are maybe not entirely the most revolutionary one compared to the incorrect way that Klein handled art. That's why at the beginning I talked to Hannah Arendt when he said that every time the work disappears without leaving a trace, it has a connection with politics. And in a sense, Klein confronted the problem head-on, where the situationists forbid the problem to be erased. Because they forbade painters to paint. Whereas Klein invented a kind of art that would fulfill exactly the position that art was could have been in a context of a consumer society where everything was consumed. He took consumerism to the end, literally, by consuming the artwork in the sale. See? That was an interesting operation.
One quick question.
Yeah?
So how much does a copy of Hot Match go for these days? The magazine?
Yeah, of course.
A lot.
A lot.
But can you even get the coin piece? Who knows?
Who said that capitalism doesn't exist anymore because Klein or the situationists existed? They did what they could, and they had a certain influence on the happening on May 68, not as much as was intuited or claimed, but still, they were creating a context in which something like May 68 would happen. They were one of the elements. Klein's another story. I don't think Klein had much to do with May 68, but like May 68, he created art events which were not meant to remain and to be bought, but disappeared, just like this rebellion of the 68 disappeared and never turned into a revolution.
And what year did he die, Klein?
What?
What year did Klein die?
What year
Todd.
did he die?
Oh, one Klein in 1963. He died of a heart attack. The first heart attack he had was in Nice, in Cannes, sorry, when this film, Mondo Cane.
Yeah, Mondo Cane. I was going to ask you about that. Have you seen that? Have you seen Mondo Cane?
Yeah, long time ago.
Where they have the scene where he's being painted, the women are being painted.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, of course, Klein was overjoyed when the team came and photographed his women, naked women, making painting, and he expected that this would be the official recognition of his genius. So he came with a sports car, very dashing. He came to that and they expected everyone to applaud, etc. And he was totally horrified to discover that he was shown in the context of monsters. And he had a heart attack right there and then.
Wow. what I love about him being in Mondokane is it's meant to be this reverse anthropology about Europe and primitivism. You know?
Yes.
So it's a box set. They just reissued like six of them, and it was very controversial when it came out because it juxtaposed European culture with primitive people from around the world.
Yeah.
So
But that's what
rituals.
they were all doing in the 60s when we were in Mallarmé.
Yeah.
You know, Lévi-Strauss, etc.
Yeah.
They're all translating back and forth between primitive and cultures and the consumer society. They were consuming primitive cultures in another way.
Do you think that they knew, or did Yves Klein know Jean Cocteau, or were they in a similar scene?
Jean Cocteau?
Yeah. He was much older.
No, yes, he was older.
Yeah.
He was older. He was part of the situation.
Early.
He was part of the surrealist group, but apart from the surrealist group, since he was gay, he wasn't very well received by the natural, the group around Bottom. But no, he made his film about at the same time, though.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Maybe.
I remember I was a student then, and I saw both of them at the same time.
I really appreciated your answer. I think that makes me very happy. And I thought that description of the artist was one, I think I've heard many art talks about artists, and I think this is probably one of the most sympathetic that I maybe have heard. But I think it's very problematic to associate art with the secondary commodities market for the super class, and to really create that as the definition for what art is, especially and to reinterpret what the actions the situationists and Klein, not specifically Klein, perhaps more of what the situationists were undertaking, which is a direct assault on one of the first order values of art, which is that, as you indicated, that the art survives the artist and can create connections among generations in a singular experience, a visceral singular experience that's direct. The triangulation between the artist, the painter, and the viewer, that restores a sense of continuation and humanity, and therefore an inherently hopeful act, and is why art has survived the situationists, the super classes, the kings and queens, the tyrants of every variety, and every sort of kind of assault that's occurred over the last 800 or 900 years.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure about the present situation. I think lots of things are changing, including art. I think that art is probably would need to be reinvented, and art is now being reinvented, and another kind of art is coming out of that, right? I'm not saying that an art that will escape the market, but I think now we have a state which is very ambivalent, like everything that happens in capitalism. Art is on the verge of disappearing, and art is on the verge of turning into something else, right? In other words, you have like an army of artists throughout the globe. Now we're involved in every possible activity that defines society. Biology, garbage, anything we want. We find already artists behind it. And what is most interesting is that all these activities could be had under that heading. It doesn't have to be artistic anymore. But the art world has expanded itself to such a degree, it's become so obese that there's no more limits to it. So what I'm saying is that it's not that artists are creating that. The system now is abolishing every barrier that exists, including what made art possible as art. So now art is everywhere, or art is nowhere. And we don't exactly know which way it's going to go. We don't know if what is traditionally defined as art is going to persevere as art. We don't know the art as another destination. A few years ago, already banks were calling upon young artists who have imagination to work for them. Right? Because an artist being open-ended and having creative idea, it doesn't have to end up in a museum. Right? I mean, because even museums themselves lose all the boundaries and expand widely as if there was a cancer. How much can they contain? So we are at an interesting conjunction. We've exactly know. No, we don't exactly know exactly. We don't know where the world is going. We don't know where art is going. And what's interesting is that now, at least, I know that some friends from e-floods are trying to repertory the range of activities that have been going on over the last 20 years under the name of art, so that you have at least categories that would be recognized as art. Right? But it's already maybe already too late.